Hello, freedom loving people. Welcome to our last episode for the Restricted Handling podcast in 2025. Got Glenn and myself calling in here on December 31st. Wanted to cover what we saw in 2025, what's coming up in 2026 in the world, international security and geopolitics. What just happened over the past week. Here's where we end the year with Russia. Putin just gave his annual speech to the country. Ukraine, the fighting is still very much at the forefront. He didn't talk about casualties at all. 156,000 killed, it looks like, on the Russian side. Likely more than that, just what can be proven. Average age of those who have died now is about 21 to 23, which is a really sad story. They're continuing their fight. There's serious hard lines drawn with Ukraine in terms of negotiating. And of course, Zelensky just met with President Trump in Florida very recently. Trump made this statement that maybe we're getting close to some kind of an end to this. We will see. China, President Xi also gave his annual address to the nation and, not surprisingly, vowed that he would reunify Taiwan with China. Still a very hardline stance. China's economy is doing fairly well. Bit of deflationary pressure, still housing issues, housing market issues. Contrasted with Russia, Russia's having really hard go of it. Revenue is down, oil revenue in particular. The workforce is diminished greatly. Iran is still degraded considerably going into this new year. And obviously, we as the US are looking more at Venezuela and Latin America in our own hemisphere. Glenn, what else are we missing going in as we round out 2025?
Ooh, yeah. Great summary. I mean, before we jump into that, I do want to say you and I both know what it's like to be far away from our families on New Year's, on Christmas, on Thanksgiving, or whatever you can name the holidays. So I do want to start out by saying thank you to all those Americans that are standing watch, whether it's overseas or at home, in the military, in the intelligence community, law enforcement, emergency rooms around the country, emergency services. So, and like I always take a little bit of time, like on these days, to just think about those people because we were there, and it's not easy. So, and especially when you're very young.
Is there anything you used to do for, when you were chief of station somewhere with folks on New Year's or over Christmas?
I can neither confirm nor deny that I was ever a chief of station, but no. That's kind of a joke. I mean, Jesus. I can confirm I was. And yeah, we had a tradition of anybody that was TDY, temporarily, in that country away from family, we would try and have them over or do some kind of event for them to make sure that they were not alone, and, as a leader, you have to make sure that your people are taking care of each other. Say like tonight for New Year's, one of my favorite officers ever is coming over to have a drink with us, her and her new husband. So we're very, very blessed that way. On many Christmas Eves, many New Year's Eves, we were at work. We were in the office, right? Because unfortunately, especially in the terrorism world, terrorists are very inconsiderate.
They are.
Right? They just want to do stuff like on our holidays. It's horrible.
Especially Christian holidays.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I'm not going to name the service. There's one service that tried to ruin all my St. Patrick's days, and I didn't appreciate it. On that note, I would say, okay, we go back to the geopolitical piece, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, down the board, let's start with Iran. I mean, Iran, there's protests happening right now. The economy's in the dumps. We may be going into the new year with some serious change in the regime. By the way, my doctor, who is Iranian American, predicted this back in August. He told me that by I think he said in the new year, the early new year, there's going to be a big change. So China, let's see what the Chinese are just doing again with Taiwan. More pressure applied. We had a great guest on yesterday, and I'm sure everyone's watching the video with Nick and his comments about Chinese. I think that makes a lot of sense. They don't really want to have to go to war. They just want to intimidate their way to victory, right? Psychologically victory. And they're putting a lot of pressure on the Taiwanese right now and on other partners in the region, testing the United States. His comment about the Chinese economy, I thought was very interesting too. It's not as good as they like to portray it as being. And that's an old trick that countries use, including Russia and China, to try and convince people they're in better shape than they are, right? Well, Gaza, right? The truce there is holding. I think one of the things we'll see, we jump into what's going to happen in the new year, but this last year, there was a lot of initial success on trying to either end or slow down some of these conflicts, right? In Gaza, in Lebanon, Lebanese Hezbollah was put back a step. We had a great guest on, a week ago, David Hale, Ambassador Hale, talking about, the Levant. Or if you look at in Central Africa, Rwanda, Congo, the conflict there, DRC, that in the beginning of the year was a huge issue. It's kind of calmed down, right? And the administration of President Trump keeps talking about all the peace peace treaties he's negotiated. I think Thailand, Cambodia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. There's been a lot of progress, right? Initial progress. I said before, what's going to be key is sustainment. But I think the administration deserves credit for making that progress. And going into the new year, I think a lot of that's going to be tested. And there may be some other opportunities that come up. Let's, go back to late 2024 when the Syrian regime collapsed and Trump came to office. One of the big surprises was his engagement with the Syrian president, right? And rolling back sanctions. So what are we going to do with Iran if the government collapses? What will we do with Russia? I've been saying this for a while. What is the plan? Who has a plan, right? How do we engage or not engage? Who do we want to engage with?
Glenn, for something like that with Russia, for instance, who in the government gets the paper of like, I got the plan? Who in the government does somebody look to when it's Russia or Iran?
In the U.S. government or in the?
Yeah. Is it the NSC that's expected to pull that together?
I think traditionally probably, but it depends on the president and the personality. And then there's my experience was their just personalities play a big role. We saw in the previous administration, the director of the CIA, Bill Burns, had a big role in a lot of the diplomacy. He was kind of the pseudo Secretary of State, people would say. Previous administration, Kissinger, when he was the head of the NSC and Sec State, he had a huge role. In this administration, I think it's very personality driven. There are some players, including special envoys, that are playing a big role. And of course, the president himself is directly involved and interested in a lot of these topics. He just met with Zelensky. He's been extremely active on the diplomatic front in a lot of these engagements. And, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know that there is a plan, right? I don't know. I think I said this yesterday with Nick, we spend so much time doing the tactical. We did. Maybe that's changed, but I'm skeptical.
So let's roll this into big surprises from 2025. You just mentioned a couple there. I would say on my side, if you had told me what was going to happen in Iran with us taking a strike on some of their facilities right after Israel, I would have said no chance. To me, that was a huge surprise. And then I would say the other one for me is just I expected the US economy to take a bigger hit than it has now with tariffs, the relationship with China, how contested it's been back and forth, but somehow stock markets are moving ahead. The housing market's not incredible in the US, obviously, but I really did think it was going to be worse than it is today.
Right.
How about on your end, Glenn? What are you seeing as big surprises this past year?
Well, definitely, I mentioned Syria. The speed with which the administration was willing to move on some of these issues, Azerbaijan, Armenia, for the president to have President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan in the Oval Office, his engagement with the Central Asian leaders. There's been a lot of things that, traditionally just don't happen. Obviously I was not expecting and I was not excited or happy at all about this kind of the early approach to Russia, Ukraine and kind of criticisms of the Ukrainians. I don't agree that, that the Ukrainians are the problem. I was not surprised that the president engaged Putin and I was not against that. I'm not against it. You have to have a dialogue, try and end this thing. But I am a little bit surprised that the administration seems to keep allowing the Russians to kick the can down the road, which is a little frustrating for me as an American. I don't think that that's very wise. Western Hemisphere, not surprised. If you looked at, what Americans are concerned about, right? I wrote an article 2 years ago about this, like the southern border, the Western Hemisphere. And it's been very good that there's been a lot more attention on the Western Hemisphere, for sure. I think a lot of people in Washington are struggling with this. They're just not used to the shift. And a lot of people that are very comfortable with Europe and the Middle East don't like, it's ironic, but they're not happy that there's been this kind of reorientation to our backyard.
Is that because it takes the focus away from what they've worked on for so long?
I hate to say it, but I think yes. It's hard when you're like in the lead position and then all of a sudden, like you're not the person they're calling every day. I was joking last year, okay, like surprises, Greenland, like who thought Greenland would be such an issue? And I used to joke, like, can you imagine there was one analyst probably somewhere in the bowels of a building. He was the Greenland analyst and no one has seen him for years. And then remember, like Spies Like Us, he was the Dan.
I was going to say he was like Dan Aykroyd in Spies Like Us.
His dictionaries and right. And then next thing you know, he's the guy, like they're like, hey, the president wants to see you. What? Right. And now he's like, he's up there with the director of CIA or the director of DIA and, the NSDNI, whatever. So I didn't expect Greenland at all, but other issues like I didn't predict that the face of warfare has completely changed. We had a couple of shows on with people doing the UAVs, the FPVs, Joey Gagnar,
Makar from, yeah, these guys from Ukraine.
and hopefully we'll have some of that, more of that into the new year in 2026. But that, like that's kind of stunning the way things have changed very, very quickly on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are scrambling now to try and understand how that's going to impact the U.S. military, like our warfighting capabilities. So it's always something you have to watch out for. I think this is, go back to Russia. Putin, the people around him, he was in this information vacuum, this bubble in 2022, and people were telling him, "Oh, we can take Ukraine in, a week, 3 days." How'd that work out? As you said, 1 million plus people, casualties.
Yep.
Russian economy struggling. What has it gotten them? Incremental. Yeah, okay, they've done a land grab and they're getting maybe a couple of kilometers a year for that
Oh,
expense.
so slow. What went under the radar in the past year? Anything that you think more people should be talking about that they're not? For me, I'm surprised we don't talk a little bit more about the DPRK, what they're doing, especially having sent troops to Russia, getting like real battlefield experience for the first time, new weapon systems, much closer relationship with some of our adversaries. Doesn't seem to catch as much attention as in the past. So I would say that's one that was a bit surprising. Modi's shift a little bit closer to China also, I think could have been more significant or could have been brought up a little bit more towards the second half of this year. And then one that just happened in the past 2 months, maybe past month. I am by no means an expert on this. We just learned that China has the capability. I don't think they've been able to successfully deploy it, but this EUVL, extreme ultraviolet lithography, has come up a couple times. It's very quiet. It's their ability to make cutting edge semiconductors and something that they did not have the skill to do prior. We still don't think they can apply it, but I think there were some leaks about them having this capability now that could position them more strongly going into 2026 or certainly 2027. So
Right.
just a few things that come to mind. How about for you? Under the radar.
I think, Ryan, to me, when we talked about this, I think yesterday, the day before, like the Arctic,
Yeah.
every once in a while, there's some news of, some reporting, very interesting reporting or analysis of what's going on in the Arctic, the Chinese, the Russians, the threat to the homeland, and then it kind of goes away. And I think this is the trend I see, like the DPRK, we go back to like Africa, it gets a little attention for a couple of days, something happens, and then it kind of, it recedes into the background, the counterterrorism issue. You just saw that we took a bunch of strikes in Syria. We lost, by the way, God bless them. We lost some troops there to an ISIS attack. And then we responded in Africa, where, I think it was in Nigeria, where the administration went after some of the Boko Haram targets. So it's just, there's so many things happening all the time. You just have to constantly be paying attention. I mean, another surprise, by the way, and it shouldn't have been a surprise if you really look at things kind of like this at the end of the year, the national security strategy, Europe, a lot of discussion about Europe and, different values or, a clash, kind of cultural clash, ideological clash, maybe between like the administration and some of the European countries. I didn't expect that, but
Yeah.
I shouldn't be surprised because, this, you could have seen this coming. And in the year to come, that's an issue to watch very closely.
Completely agree.
We talk about having the Europeans pick up more of the load and do more things. And I'm an advocate for that because we can't carry the burden forever. And this country's carried a lot of burden. But we should remember NATO had multiple purposes. It wasn't just to protect Europe from the Soviet Union. And we're going to have countries that, are going to challenge us internationally, either militarily or diplomatic politically. And we're just going to have to be ready for it. Because when you tell countries, like we mentioned yesterday, Japan, right? The Japanese kind of taking a new tack, rearming, right? There's history there. And I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I would say we just need to understand what comes with that. Because when the Japanese people are paying more for their national defense and, their sons and daughters are going to serve, then they're going to say, we want to have more of a say in how this is handled. We don't always want to take from Washington. And why would they?
I mean, that plays right into kind of disappointments for 2025. I'd say one of those for me is just the continuing decline of our relationship with European partners who, I'm very much biased from how I grew up and where I served in the military and the government. Just seeing us get further and further from some of these people who bled with us in the past, I hate seeing. I understand they need to spend more and they did a lot of that to themselves, should have stepped up when they could have. But I also don't want to get to a point where we really can't rely on some of those partners when we'll need them in the future. And who knows when that will happen. I'd say
Right.
my other disappointments more recently, a little recency bias, was around the EU not taking advantage of Russia's frozen assets with Euroclear in Belgium. I was born in Belgium, holds a very dear place in my heart. I was really hoping that they would go ahead and use those Russian assets. I understand the legal ramifications, but if one country can just go ahead and invade a neighbor unprovoked, please go ahead and do this. They figured out a way to get funding in place, but it's going to be more costly for Europe. And then I just wish we had supported Ukraine more from the US. What about you? Disappointments for the past year?
Again, like in the Europe thing, I'm like you. I have very good experiences and memories living in Europe, serving in Europe, working with our European partners. We have to be realistic. When we say Europe, that's like saying the United States. There's a lot of different subcultures, right? There's different countries, trends. Going back to issues we need to keep an eye on is the Balkans. Like, that's still a tinderbox. And that's like what we call it, like when you're a callus that someone can push if they want to distract us. That's someone being Putin, right? Some of the situation in the Balkans. But I like in terms of disappointment, yeah, I'm disappointed that we seem to still be holding Ukraine like at the same level as Russia for responsibility, or maybe even it seems the perception is like we're more critical of the Ukrainians. I don't agree with that. I understand that you have to talk to the Russians, you have to try and have some kind of relationship. I've never been against that. But I think we need to be realistic. And going back to something you said, like partners, we're going to need partners. We need to think strategically 10 years
Yeah.
from now, like what's going to be going on after this war is over? What are the consequences of a war like this? And just the mass number of people with PTSD who need jobs, who are looking and they're killers, they're fighters. What are they going to do? Let's look at what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. Like there was organized crime problems, there was transnational crime problems. Who's going to help us deal with that? Like that's helped us with the counterproliferation, counterterrorism. We needed partners. I say this all the time when I speak publicly. Like we needed partners. By the way, for those people that listen, I do have a public speaking business. So if anyone has a company that likes someone to come speak, Dave Fitz, who is our guest tonight, we have Vector One Global. We do training and we do public speaking. And I'd say this all the time, like we need those partners. We couldn't have stopped a lot of these terrorist attacks against the homeland by ourselves, right? Nobody can do it all by themselves. So we need partners.
And Glenn, you hit, you mentioned Vector One and speaking, but also, I don't know if you may not be able to name the companies, but you are hired for strategic insights in these different areas because businesses want to get in. They want to understand what's happening in some of these regions. You know it very well. You stay up with it. We want to see more of that, right? We want to see more connective tissue economically from the business community. As you mentioned, like this business diplomacy, economic diplomacy is, to me, truly like that is a big surprise. I don't know if I recognized it during the first Trump administration, but that is a big deal right now. The tariffs, the economic weight we're throwing around is a serious policy lever today that we haven't seen in a while.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, yeah, like this commercial diplomacy, like this focus on, using American business to do some of our diplomacy, represent the United States. I'm not against that at all. I think it makes a lot of sense. Go back to like the beginning of the Cold War. A lot, when I studied in the Soviet Union in the 80s, who had the power was MTV, Levi's, Coca-Cola, and Playboy. Like people were very, very interested in those things. Like those brand names were pretty important. And there was kind of an image of the United States that came not from the government, but came from the private sector. And going back to companies, yeah, there are some companies that, that are hiring people now to try and understand what's going on in the world. I think that's very smart because whether we like it or not, like there's no coming home. There's no just, pulling everything back and not being part of the integrated international business community.
Glenn, I'm going to go from disappointments from last year to some of the hopeful aspects. So I pulled up a couple examples of people who did things that in my book show some tremendous intestinal fortitude. So in really looking at Russia and China, in Russia, there's a 19-year-old, Daria Kosireva, scrawled some poetry, anti-war poetry in public in April. She was accused of discrediting the Russian army, was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison for this. So this is literally writing on a wall somewhere. Another one, activist lawyer Alexei Sokolov. He was basically committed to documenting torture and abuse in Russian prisons. Just this past month, he was arrested and charged with treason. This could be life in prison for him. And terrible to hear somebody who's trying to expose what's going on. And then the thing that, like probably the one that's closest to my heart, and I wish we would see more of this, Lydia Yegorova, mother of a mobilized soldier who had a solo picket, so on her own was protesting outside the Ministry of Defense in Russia, demanding her son's demobilization. She was detained for 48 hours, also discrediting the army, disobeying police. I wish we'd see more people like this. I don't know if I would do any of this, truly. Like if I were in their position, if I could do that. So I just think the world of people like this. Glenn, I'm sure you have seen many examples of this work in Russia over your career.
I'm glad you raised this. Like there's a group now, there's a young, if they're teenagers, it's called Stop Time. It's like a rock group. And they were arrested for performing songs that were banned by the regime. And this has started kind of like around the country, young people are going out and spontaneously performing these songs. So there's kind of like this little movement. I wouldn't call it like anything huge right now, but these young people are going to the street and they're trying to get their voices heard, and you got to give them credit. By the way, there were some senior officials in Russia who stepped down from their jobs because they disagreed with the policy. And you have to really respect those people. Like I'm not wearing a hat, or else I take my hats off to, I'm not going to name any names, but just really like that takes a lot of courage. I wrote an article, I think it was last year, about a guy who was basically it's like their major think tank. And he was an American expert, and he gave up his job because he criticized this war. And he criticized the way that they demonized the United States for, basically his point was, we're doing this to make an excuse to, distract from our real problems. So there are a lot of very brave people. And, the question is always the question always people have is like, when are they going to really go to the streets? But as you said, like if you were in their shoes, it could be life or death. So, and there are, look, you mentioned China. There are other countries. There are probably, let's give credit to the Ukrainians who continue to push the corruption investigations. The Midas. We got to give them credit. Like I'm sure that there was a lot of pressure on them, and they were very nervous, like to continue these investigations. But they did the right thing, and we have people that do that in the United States all the time too.
In China, couple examples. In Hong Kong, you've got Miles Kwan, Anna Kwok, separate incidents, but both of them drawing attention to some form of government censorship or overreach. Miles launched an online petition, got 10,000 signatures. This was related to the deadly Hong Kong apartment fire that many will recall from the past few months. He was arrested, will likely be imprisoned. Anna, Hong Kong activist in exile, has a $115,000 bounty on her head for some of the work she did around a Hong Kong self-determination referendum. And then lastly, Jimmy Lai. This one has been in the news quite a bit. Very well-off founder of the Apple Daily newspaper. He has been detained. He is likely going to get life in prison for trying to just publish the truth. And it's pretty sad, but also very commendable to these people. And I hope we see more of this in 2026. I hope we can help them on the show somehow, just bring light to what they're doing, give them a little bit more of a voice over here in the US.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, and we should mention a few of the guests we had on this past, past few months. We had Ambassador Hale, 40 years in the US government, expert on the Middle East. We had Natalia, who went deep on cognitive warfare with us in Russia, like fantastic interview. And we had my old man on, who also spent decades in USG at State. We talked India, Pakistan with him. He spent a lot of time there. You know that region well. We had a couple interviews with folks from the front lines in Ukraine, talking about ground vehicles, UAVs, the combined arms experience there. We had retired USASOC CW5 Joey Ganyard talking all things drones, AI. David Fitzgerald, as you mentioned, Latin America expert, talking Venezuela as it was popping off with covert action going on there. And then Ralph Goff, who I would sit in meetings in the back row and he'd be at the front table or he'd be up on the VTC and I'm just like schmuck in the back. You two called in from Ukraine. Yeah. So to me, couldn't be more thankful for this past year. I appreciate it.
Yeah, amen. And all those guests that came on. And again, we have some more lined up. We're going to have some great guests talking about different issues. And I should have mentioned, like the other thing, the big thing for me this past year was I got to go back to Lebanon, which I hadn't been there since in a while. And that was a great visit. And that was with Ambassador Hale, working for a think tank that he had a project on. So, and of course, many, many trips back to Turkey, which is a dynamic country, a lot of friends there.
Yep. All right, let's do 2026. What's coming up? So we got some big events, obviously US midterms. There are big elections in Israel. Winter Olympics, for those who are looking for something on the world stage in case there are protests or attacks. We obviously hope not. So high level issues, but I would say the midterms are going to drive a lot of news cycles here.
Our foreign adversaries will try and exploit that and use that, and our allies as well. Let's be honest. I mean, everyone's going to have their information ongoing. So I think we're just going to try and report the facts as they are and get on some great guests who have insights into different issues. For me, I mean, going into the next year, we're going to have to really keep watching Russia, Ukraine. You know, the president says that they're very close to a ceasefire or a deal, some kind of deal. I hope he's right.
Let me hit you with predictions then. Here's our true and false, Glenn. You ready?
Okay.
Put
All
you
right.
and I on the record.
Okay.
Will we invade Venezuela in 2026?
My
True or false?
my mic is cat, and that's what
I think we probably will. I think we're going to have boots on the ground in Venezuela. I'm going to say.
Yeah,
yes.
I get how do you define invade? I think probably maybe like the same approach that the Chinese are taking with Taiwan. Get what we want without having to launch a major military operation or invasion. I don't think this president wants a major like ground operation or war like that. But we have problems there and we got to deal with them.
All right, turning to NATO. NATO will add at least one new member by the end of 2026. Maybe a Balkan country.
False.
False. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's in the cards.
I tend to agree with you on that one. U.S. peacekeepers will be on the ground somewhere in Ukraine or Russia by the end of next year.
False.
What about EU peacekeepers?
Potentially peacekeepers from EU countries, although I think that's hard to imagine as well. Up till now, the Kremlin is pushing back on that hard.
Yeah, they're calling that a red line. There will be a ceasefire and peace treaty agreed to in Ukraine by July.
True.
I agree. We could speculate on what that'll look like, but I think that will be the case.
Right.
Zelensky will no longer be the president in Ukraine by the end of next year.
Ooh, I'm not going to comment on the internal political machinations of any country. I mean, he has said that if there's a peace agreement or some kind of ceasefire, he's willing to hold elections. So good for him. Let's hear Putin say the same thing. Fair, by the way, free and fair elections.
That would be great. And then last one, fallout from 2025 events will cause a major downturn in world markets economically in the next year.
Ooh, false. Let me give you true and false. I got a couple for true and false.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Cuba. What's going to happen in Cuba? The Cuban regime will change in the next year. There'll be a regime change in Cuba.
False. I just think we're going to be so focused on Venezuela. I know Marco Rubio has, that's kind of his focus area to some degree, but I just think we're so entrenched in other places right now.
Okay. How about Iran? Collapse of the regime by the end of next year?
I don't think so. I want to believe that. I just don't think it'll happen. I feel like I've seen this movie before.
Okay. All right.
You? What do you think, Glenn?
I think there's going to be a regime.
That would be something.
All right. Let me do one more. Should be related to Canada. We will go to, no, I won't do that one.
Canadians, please come back and visit the U.S.
Please, we're not that.
that.
We're not that. No,
But I
we
get
have a
it.
lot of great Canadian friends.
Yeah.
No, I guess that's it for our predictions. Let's see how we are next year. That'll give us something.
That's right. Let's say you're advising the Trump administration right now going into 2026. You have to pick a couple areas to focus because they're big opportunities. What are you suggesting?
I would suggest that we need to really just bite the bullet, come down hard on Moscow. If Putin in the next, let's say, week doesn't come out and say, okay, I'm ready to make a deal along the lines of what you guys have agreed with Zelensky and Trump, because they've both spent a lot of time hashing this out. Then we just need to go, can I say this on the air, balls to the wall. We need to really ratchet up the economic pressure. We need to challenge the Russians everywhere, and we need to stop giving them the opportunity to, dangle more negotiations without actually doing something. And the something would have to be stop launching missiles at Ukrainian cities and towns and killing civilians.
Which we think is at 14,000 civilians killed, is what 14,000 plus in Ukraine.
14,000 plus. So that would be one piece of advice. The president, I would tell him, I think the American people now, this is your chance to be remembered as the president that solved this, yes, but you also the guy that called Putin's bluff. And American people are looking for this kind of leadership. I think, nobody wants a war, but nobody wants to be pushed around either or humiliated. And what else I'd say, be ready like Iran, like we need to be ready to engage, like what you did in Syria, kudos. We need to be ready there. But also I think Probably we need to think about sustainment now of some of the other progress that's been made. And, the initial agreements like Azerbaijan, Armenia, initial agreements were reached or almost reached, Gaza. We need to take it to the next level now to make it a little bit more long-term and consistent. And that's going to require a lot of diplomatic patience, expertise. I think this administration almost sometimes I think that they lack expertise in some areas, and they shouldn't, not everybody is out to get them. Like a lot of people want them to be successful because it's our country.
All right. With that, personal resolutions for next year, Glenn, as we round this out. I'll go first. You think on it. So for me, we're working to try to get a book for my old man and myself. Sometime, we'll probably write it next year. Might not come out till the following year. Kind of parallel paths through the Army and then serving abroad with the government in different capacities. So we're looking at that, growing this community, the RH community. That is quite important to me. And then I will say, I have this hope, to your point earlier about how American business in the 80s spoke for us in many ways. I am really hopeful somebody in Hollywood is going to make a badass movie about Ukraine that shows what these people have gone through for so long, that puts it in front of Americans in a way that they can consume it as opposed to news pages.
I really want to see your book. I mean, I don't know how much you can talk. You want to talk now, but like when you told me the history and the connection, it's pretty amazing. And it's going to be a great book. That's going to be a great book. Like, what a story. And it was great to meet your dad on this podcast. So we'll get him back on. Now I want to talk about Kissinger. Yeah, I don't know that I have any, I just want to, I don't know, continue to be a decent person. And I've already bit off more than I could probably chew for the next year between the books. But I do also have another book I do want to write. It's jokes that I've collected over the years. So I had this great book I found in a secondhand bookstore years ago. It's called, some cab driver in New York wrote a book of all the jokes he collected over the years. So I had that book. It was all tattered, and I brought it and I gave it to one of my Ukrainian friends. I told them, this is like me giving you like one of my kids. Like, this thing has been with me everywhere.
Wow.
But I told some of those jokes over the years. First of all, my wife's like, don't tell them anymore. And I had an uncle who had a lot of jokes. I had a lot of friends who had a lot of jokes. I had people I worked with in liaison services that had great jokes. So I collected them over the years. So I want to write a book about like the CIA officer's joke book.
It'd be great. I mean, if you have enough, could you not do one every day of the year? So you got like one of those little desk calendar ones that you flip up every day. New joke.
Probably could, but that would require discipline, which I can't even remember to bring the garbage out. So,
all right, Glenn, thanks so much. Been a great year. We got a lot more to come, folks. We're already dialing in a few new items that will add to your daily repertoire starting in 2026. We got some new guests we're teeing up. There's a lot to come. Please do connect with us, leave some comments. If you got questions or want some more analysis on something, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, we don't do this like a lot of podcasts. They start out like, please hit like or subscribe. Whatever. We don't really do that, but please hit like or subscribe.
Have a good one, Glenn. Happy New Year. Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it for free at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.